So this evening we have Marilyn Smith from Northwest Park. Marilyn has served as the manager of Northwest Park in Windsor since December of 2016. Her long career includes environmental education and conservation, developing programs and exhibits for people of all ages to foster a connection with the natural world. Marilyn will present a virtual tour of Northwest Park's diverse plant communities and wildlife. Although these ecosystems are native to our region, they require maintenance and active guardianship to ensure ongoing health and survival for future generations. The presentation will include discussion of land management at the park and how small choices made by individual homeowners can impact conservation on a larger scale. So please join me and welcome Marilyn.
Thank you. Yes, I think up front here, at least, if I don't know how the switches work here. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here this evening. I'm going to tell you, this screen is not very large, and I have some really beautiful photos to show you. Okay, but let's get to the topic tonight. Talking about how we nurture our native landscapes, because most of the park is the natural lands. The developed areas, some of the photos that you just saw, the museum, the animal barn and such, are probably the front like 10 or 12 acres of the park. And then most of it is those 12 miles of trails and all the different habitats. And conserving the land and making sure that that's there for current residents and future generations to enjoy, I think is very important. So one of the things that I pay a lot of attention to as the manager is how to preserve diverse habitats in the park. We have a very nice diversity. We have not just forest, but different types of forest. And we have pine forest and hemlock stands and a lot of mixed hardwood and younger forest and older forest. But we have a lot of different wetlands. There's the Rainbow Reservoir, the Farmington River wraps around two sides of the park. But we have little ponds that are year-round. There's a little entry pond even, I'm sure you've all seen. But we have a big beaver pond down close to the reservoir. We didn't make that, the beavers did, right? And there are many little vernal pools on the property too that, they're wet in the spring, and then most years by mid to late summer, they're going to be dry ground again. Now last summer was really wet, so the vernal ponds lasted pretty much the whole season through. But we have a lot of different wetlands. Of course, we have glorious fields, and I'm sure every one of you is familiar with the big expanses of fields we have at the park, and I'm going to say that's one of the most special things I think about the park, and we'll get into a little bit more about why that's so special and why they're there and how we're going to keep them there. But I think having the diverse habitats is very important. We're a place of learning about the environment, so we want more than just one tract of landscape or habitat. And also, as we preserve different types of habitats, we're preserving the species of plants and the wildlife that live in those habitats, right? We don't have to, the staff at the park don't have to run around, making sure, okay, turtle, go to bed, okay, frog, we're going to put you in the wetland. If you have the right habitat, they will be there, they will come, right? So it's making sure the habitats are healthy and we don't have any bad disturbances. So it's both looking at the landscape level and looking at the species that are within them. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the different major habitat types and just talk a little bit about them and what makes them special and who lives there, just a little bit. Know that I'm doing this on a very general overview. Almost every one of these I could really break down into like what kind of field, and we'll get into some nuances, but we don't have time for a whole college course here, but it's really a very complex thing, and the animals and the plants are all very interconnected, so it makes it very interesting to manage. So I mentioned those wonderful fields, and you see the old tobacco sheds that are still standing, and you look out across that horizon, and I know that's really meaningful to people, both from maybe a historic point of view or a nostalgic point of view, remembering when there was a lot more of those kind of vistas around town, but also just as a habitat, the wide open spaces, it's sunny, right? You have a farther view, and I think I'm going to go right on to the next. Here are a few of our plant friends, native field plants in this part of the country. Did you know grasses could be so beautiful? I don't know if you're getting a good view of that. That one is, I think, my favorite grass species. It's called Indian grass. It has this very soft, brown, it's kind of silky seed head. And right here it's in full bloom. A lot of the grasses will pop out, you know, a little bit of color in the petals. So we have some native Indian grass. The other side of the screen is a clump of little blue stem, which is a wonderful native grass. You see a little bit of sort of purpley, reddish blue in those stems there. And somebody over here, one of our friends, knew that pinkish Joe Pye weed flower in the middle. Those pop up in the fields. There are many different species. This is just a tiny smattering, but you'll recognize black-eyed Susan, I think, and our common milkweed. It's a wonderful thing to see the diversity of plants in the field. Lots of grasses, but there will be those flowering plants as well. And a lot of the life, a lot of what really goes on in the field is almost out of view, hidden down in between the stems, right? They're growing very densely. But here are just a few of the different, I try to throw in a little bit of this and that to whet your appetite. The beautiful bright blue bird down there in the lower right, that's not an eastern bluebird. Does anybody recognize that?
It's an indigo bunting.
It's an indigo bunting. And if you've seen them, they're pretty common if you walk along the pathways that go between the fields out there, not in the winter, but as we get into spring, summer. The indigo buntings a lot of times are flitting between the trees and flying around. And if you catch one when the sun hits it just right, blue fire, right? It's just, yeah, amazing. And actually the eastern bluebirds can do that too. But these are smaller, they're kind of goldfinch size. They have that heavy bill for cracking seeds open and eating. And they're just gorgeous. Box turtle, the eastern box turtle. They like the fields, they might get into the edge of the woods too. We actually have a very healthy population of the eastern box turtle at Northwest Park. I started my career as a naturalist in southwestern Ohio. And we used to, almost every time you go out with a group of kids, you'd find a box turtle somewhere on the trail. But here in the east, I think because this part of the country has been settled so much longer by the European immigrants, their habitat has been disturbed, a lot of them have been collected or hit on roads, and the populations are really suffering. They're much lower here than they would have been when the first settlers came into the area. So it's really a wonderful thing to know that we still have a healthy box turtle population. The box turtles are not water turtles. If you see the shape of the shell, that's not a very dynamic for swimming. They have stumpy legs. They don't have the webbed feet. They're not water turtles. But they have, I don't know if any of you realize, box turtles are called that because on their lower shell they have a hinge that can close up tight. So when they pull in their head and their feet, like most turtles do, they actually can shut just tight as like a rock. And so I've known people would say, well, my dog found one in the yard, was chewing on its shell, or a raccoon found it, and turtle's not going to come out until they're left alone again, and there's nothing much for a predator to eat in that shell. So they have a pretty good defense mechanism. Hognose snake in the upper right. You may not be snake fans, all of you, but they're a pretty special snake. They're not very common. They very much depend on the grassy field environment. You won't find them deep in the woods. And they have a really interesting habit. You know how an opossum can sort of play dead if they're frightened? Hognose snakes sort of do a similar thing, this very dramatic flipping over and hoping that any potential predator would just say, ew, I don't want to eat a dead snake, and go looking for a live one somewhere. Right? Beautiful. This is the smallest falcon that lives in the U.S. Did you know it's a falcon? It's called an American kestrel. Small, or a common name, a lot of times farmers would call them sparrowhawks, because they were small hawks, but they've got those, they're really good flyers. Those are quite threatened. They're not very common anymore because they like to hunt in the grasslands. And a lot of grasslands have been lost in this country. We don't have them commonly in the park, but we do have some nest boxes out there put in just for the kestrels, and there are some volunteers that monitor them, and I think about 3 years ago, they did have some chicks that were raised. So we're keeping an eye to see if they'll come back. And finally, we have our beautiful little tiger beetle in the corner. Who knew? It's like emerald. I mean, it's like something that the pharaohs would, use for jewelry. Just a beautiful little beetle running around on the ground, but they depend on those grasslands. Open sandy soils, which we have at the park. All right, well, moving on to a whole nother landscape, we have thickets. Not the most exciting, right? I mean, let's go visit the thicket, right? It's just a shrubby, it's when a grassland has sort of grown past just being grassy. We're going to kind of go through these landscapes in the order that they would progress on their own. So if we just leave it alone, eventually young trees start growing, shrubby things, woody things start coming in, and this looks a little more kind of the edge. This, yeah, you see that? I call it the gawky teenage phase, right? It's not the most pretty, sure can't walk through it very easily, but it's a natural stage in the succession of the landscape. So if we just leave the fields alone, pretty soon, after about 15 years or so, it's going to be quite dense thicket. And well, that's on its way to becoming forest, right? There are some wildlife that just depend on having more of those woody plants. They like the extra cover that they get from the dense shrubs, those woody stems. It's very hard for a predator to navigate through or to see if it's a raptor that would want to fly over. So it's a good place to hide. And they can be pretty productive, growing a lot of different fruits and seeds. Just pulled out photos of a few of the types of woody things that might start coming in. This is a very young gray birch tree starting to grow in. One of the earlier trees that if you see a forest with a lot of birch, it's probably a fairly young forest. Red twig dogwood, that's a native that you may be aware of if you've been gardening or landscaping and thinking about things that would have winter interest maybe. Or red twig dogwood is a pretty popular shrub to use. Well, it's native. And staghorn sumac, they're around. they're kind of pretty in the fall, and then the leaves turn bright scarlet. I do know with those tempting looking red seeds, but they seem kind of bristly. I recently read that most wildlife, it's not their favorite. How do the scientists know that? Because it's the last thing that they'll eat. They wait till all the other seeds have been picked off of the plants, all the other fruits and berries are gone, and then late winter, like, okay, I guess we'll eat some sumac seed. But there are quite a few birds that really love the thickets. And by the way, I should mention, Northwest Park has been designated by National Audubon Society as an important bird area. That's a really big deal. It's a big deal. That's a program that Audubon launched probably 15 to 20 years ago now, to kind of identify state by state the sites that have real value for conservation value, and it's primarily because of our fields and thickets that made Northwest Park kind of special for that.
So I have a question about
Sure.
the thickets and the fields.
Sure.
Because my Kiwanis Club has gone in several years, and I know they cut down certain areas, and then we had to get rid of all the debris. But the big fields, are they cut down at the?
Yeah, well, I'll show you, and I'll tell you what we do as we go along, because these are habitats that do take managing, and so,
That's what I
and what we're looking to do is maintain, like I said, the diversity, and so we have fields, we want thickets, we want forest, so we'll get to that.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so these are some of the birds that make Northwest Park special, along with the field birds that I showed you. Blue-winged warbler passing through, they like to, you might see them up in the tall branches of a young tree, but where it's pretty open and still field or thicket around. A brown thrasher is, a lot of these species are really in decline these days because the habitat is in decline. It's one of the reasons. Brown thrasher is quite a rambunctious bird. It's pretty big, a little larger than a mockingbird, and pretty noisy. They mimic, they make all sorts of sounds. Up on the right, do you recognize what that is? It's an oriole. I wondered if you'd recognize, but it's not a Baltimore. A Baltimore oriole is a really bright orange, and that's one that if the sun hits them right, orange fire, right? Well, with this one, this is an orchard oriole, and we have both species at the park, but the orchard orioles especially like to hang out in the thicket areas. So they're a little more kind of a terracotta or brick red. The rufous-sided towhee down in the corner there, they like to live on the ground or look for food on the ground. They're really a great big overgrown sparrow. And you'll hear something, if there's some shrubs and it's hard to see in there, and I'll hear something's rustling in there, and I'll be trying to see who is it. A lot of times it turns out to be a towhee, and the way they feed, they get in there where they're really out of sight and such, but they kick at the ground with their feet. And some of the smaller sparrows, you might, if you have a bird feeder, you might see them do that. They feed on the ground underneath. So the towhee likes to get in there and kick at the leaves and then look to see what he's scared of, little insects and things. So these are just a few of the birds that really depend on having, they don't like just the open grassy field, but they don't like the deep forest. They like that kind of scruffy thicket. So thicket may not be the most beautiful landscape from our point of view, but it can be important for wildlife. Just doing a few photos of younger forest. Do you notice this? It's pretty much all trees, but you see something about the size of those trees? They're not very big, and they're pretty similar size, right? We've got a lot of young forest at Northwest Park. You know why? Because it used to be tobacco farmland, right? It used to be agricultural fields, and if it was left alone, it probably grew through a number of years of field starting to get other types of plants in there, and eventually went through that gawky thicket stage, and eventually maybe it's birch tree and black cherry and a few other black locust maybe starting to come in. But it's all sort of one generation of trees that are getting established. So probably when they started growing, it wasn't shady. It was pretty sunny still. And they're all coming up together as young forest. There are a number of species that really like that young forest. It also kind of exemplifies the edge of a forest, even where you have a more mature forest. A lot of species, even if they live in the forest interior or they live out in the grassy field, they use those edge habitats for feeding or for cover. It might be a bird that feeds on seeds in the field, but when a predator comes, flies to the edge of the trees. Or it might be a bird that nests in the deeper forest, but comes out to where it's sunnier and there are more fruits and seeds being grown. So having that variety of habitats really helps a lot. Again, just a few species. The black locust is one that you might see along the edge or in a young forest. Pops up quickly. Sometimes the pines, the white pine can come in to those areas. Do you recognize the vine? It's hanging down instead of growing up, but that's Virginia creeper. Lovely Virginia creeper. And one of the first things that turns scarlet, I think one of my favorite stages of fall is before almost anything else turns, but the Virginia creeper vines going up a tree trunk have turned scarlet, and everything else is green. And they do produce those nice berries for wildlife. But lo and behold, there are wildlife that really depend on that kind of a young forest. I don't know if this has been seen for years at Northwest Park or around here. Do you recognize maybe what this bird is? This grouse. It's a ruffed grouse. They're really something. I have flushed them in other areas hiking a lawn, and when they take off flying, boy, those wing beats are like drums. You'll really hear them, the air as it moves through. But that's one of a number of birds. The little black and white warbler that crawls up and down the tree trunks. You might be familiar with nuthatches if you feed birds, or nuthatches are more likely to come in near your yard. But a black and white warbler does a similar thing, up and down the tree trunks, looking for insects on the surface of the bark. But they like the young forest, the little more open, a little toward the edge. Do you all recognize the rose-breasted grosbeak? Yes. Gorgeous color on that breast for the male. Really very interesting bird. And you might wonder, a rabbit. Okay, yeah, we've seen rabbits. That is not a cottontail. That's not an eastern cottontail. That is a New England, I suddenly had to stop and think. It's called a New England cottontail. The rabbit you've all seen and are familiar with is almost certainly an eastern cottontail. That's a common, lives on, in the grassy fields, might make a nest in your lawn somewhere. New England cottontails have been almost eradicated. They're quite rare, and there are people working hard to reestablish them. They actually aren't right in this area of Connecticut, but they are a little more to the western, in the northwestern hills, and some other populations, I think, down near the coast, and in further north New England. They have a very specific habitat need. They won't come out and nest in your lawn or nest in the grassy field. They like the thickets in the young forest. So it's mostly due to habitat loss and the eastern cottontails taking over. So if they're a little bit smaller than the eastern cottontails, it's really hard to tell the difference. Probably none of us could choose, if we had them side by side, which is which. It's kind of hard, but it's a native species that it's disappearing. It has been disappearing, so working to see if we can help nurture them along by having the right habitat. And then we get up to what's really how I would describe our most mature forest at Northwest Park, just more of a mixed stage forest. Remember the young forest with the same size tree trunks? Get a little more mixed. I don't see anything giant in this photo, but you can see there are younger, there are older, bigger. We're starting to get a little more multi-generational forest. And so the older trees might blow down or die off, but newer ones are coming in. It's not all, exactly at the same stage. This is by no means what an ecologist would consider a really mature forest. That takes hundreds of years to get to. And given the fact that Northwest Park was mostly agricultural, we're nowhere near that, but it's a good, healthy forest. We also, as I said, I'm really simplifying here, so there are many different types of forest. We have the pine areas where it's much more predominantly pine. We have some hemlock stand and such, but generally kind of a mixture of oaks and maples and hickories and just a number of different hardwoods primarily. Here's one of the more predominant trees that come in more and more as it matures, the American beech, with that smooth gray bark, beautiful leaves. I think I put in a red oak there, just as a, hold up the banner for the oaks. But also of note in the older forest, the wildflowers in spring, right? Of all sorts. Now, when you get that more mature forest, it's not sunny on the ground most of the year, right? They're under the shade canopy. So, spring, why do flowers bloom in spring in the forest? They've got their little shot at the light before the leaves come out on the trees. And that's when they're able to make the most food, get the most energy from the sun. So, kabam, right? In a few weeks, all those spring flowers bloom on the forest floor, because the rest of the year it's going to be shady. Most of them are going to be perennials, so the roots live on year after year underground. But you see them growing up above the ground in the spring. And two of my favorites, we're really fortunate in Northwest Park to have the pink lady slipper, wild orchid.
Where?
In the forest, there are several places. We don't want to put big signs there saying, because most places, remember I said here, like the box turtles have mostly been pillaged. They're more common further west. Well, this is almost the opposite. Wherever people have been for very long, they would go dig them up. Oh, this is such a beautiful flower. I want to plant this in my yard. And, they don't transplant well. They don't, it just has really gotten rid of most of them. But somehow, miraculously, we have some really nice populations at Northwest Park, so we're very fortunate.
Is the lady slipper one of our endangered species now?
I think I forget the exact classification. The state, there are so many different, there's state endangered, state threatened, species of concern. So I don't know if anyone here knows that for sure, but they're definitely, I would say, threatened in general. I don't know exactly the classification. And then over on the right, do you recognize the Jack in the pulpit? Isn't that a special one? Really beautiful. And those are pretty common, but really special. And I know I've seen horticultural varieties of the Jack in the pulpit. And here we have, some of the wonderful species that live in the forest. You've got to be really deeper into the forest, not just on the edge. Scarlet tanager. Okay, I think I specialize in birds that look like they got plugged in and lit up. If you've seen, we've had the indigo bunting, we talked about the orioles, scarlet tanager. If you've seen a cardinal, bright red cardinal, and think, what a gorgeous bird. Imagine looking at like a Christmas tree light that's red and then plugging it in. Okay, now imagine plugging in the cardinal. That's the scarlet tanager. Photos don't do them justice. When you see them in the sun, red fire. Okay, we've got a little warbler up at the top there. That's an American redstart, the male, just black and orange, really adorable, tiny things. I mean, like this big. The pileated, or as a lot of people around here say, pileated woodpecker. That's the woody woodpecker. They're the big boys. And when you see those great big cavities in the tree, you know who made it. It takes a big deal. Do you recognize this little guy? Flying squirrel. And I think they're a lot more common around, in the forest than most of us ever would realize, because they're nocturnal and they're shy and they're secretive. And they aren't seen very frequently. I have seen them sometimes if you have a bird feeder out and you're living near a forest, and if they discover the seeds, if you don't bring it in at night, they might be coming when you're sleeping in your bed and helping themselves.
Are they tiny?
They're smaller than like the gray squirrel, quite a bit. They're not quite that small, but I'd say about like this, but those bigger eyes and little round faces, they're really sweet, but they're very shy too, so. Yeah, I think there are a lot more species of wildlife really around us than we realize, but also it means that if a species is going into decline and their population is in trouble, we may not be aware of that either without scientists out there taking census. Okay, finally, one more landscape just to mention are, of course, the wetlands. And as I said, we have many different types, Rainbow Reservoir, our Beaver Dam, very different. I mean, just between whether water is flowing, as in a river or stream, or whether it's still in a pond, makes all the difference for what kind of plants will live there, what kind of wildlife will live there. That's a very different world if you live in the water. But a few species, just collapsing them all together. This is the sweet pepper bush that can grow in shrubby marshes. Boy, when that's blooming in the summer, if you walk through, it's highly perfumed. And I know those are used horticulturally as landscape plants. First thing to bloom every spring, if you go around a vernal pond, skunk cabbage.
Yeah.
It's not the prettiest flower, and it's supposed to smell like carrion. It grows down there in the mud on the ground. I've never done the full face plant to get my nose up to the flower to smell it myself, but they're pollinated by flies. So they apparently have a kind of stinky smell to attract a fly that might think, oh, is this rotting animal? Yeah, sure, I'll have some. But it's always very encouraging to me when I'm out hiking and see skunk cabbage are up, spring's gonna come again. They can actually start growing while there's still snow on the ground. They actually warm themselves up a bit to melt through the snow. It's a pretty remarkable plant. You probably know the water lily, native water lily that you'll see on the surface of ponds. Cattails, believe it or not, cattail marshes are kind of an endangered habitat. That's an important plant. That's an important, it's a certain type of marsh, right? Where you get the dense cattails, and there are a lot of species of wildlife that specialize for that. And they're, yes, you'll still find them around, see them around, but they've really dwindled from what they used to be, how much land cover they had. And some of our wetland species, the belted kingfisher, they love to sit on a branch, and that could be over a river or a pond, but they'll dive down and get fish. Wood frogs have been calling in the last week, I've been hearing them. They have a very short season for breeding, but if you walk near a vernal pond, they only breed in vernal ponds that dry up mid-season, but you'll hear them, they sound like quacking ducks. Little quacking ducks. They live further north than any other amphibian, well up into, like northern Canada, where they just turn to ice cubes in the winter, but that doesn't seem to bother them. They're just little guys. A red-shouldered hawk like to hunt, especially around wetland areas. You get some beautiful ones in the park. Of course, the most beautiful duck in the U.S., wood duck. Wood duck. It's the male. And I did hear some last week. I was out at our marsh overlook, and I was listening to the frogs calling, and I heard a pair of wood ducks. I couldn't see them. They were back in the weeds somewhere, but I heard them when there was some sound. Does anybody know what this little guy is?
Weasel?
It's a type of weasel.
Fisher cat?
It's not a fisher, but it's something that ladies like to wear, or used to. A mink. A mink. Yes. They specialize in wetlands, for sure. It's a type of weasel. They're pretty big. I saw one actually last summer, not here in Windsor, but in western Connecticut. I saw one near a wetland area. It actually came running across the road in front of my car, but they're black and long and skinny, and go hopping along. So all species that really depend on having the wetlands, right? Okay, let's see how we're doing here. Okay, so how do landscapes change? You know, I've said we have these different ones. We have the field, and it can become a thicket, and it can become a young forest, an older forest. Something that, you know, if we didn't change anything, we'd end up with just forest everywhere, right, eventually. How do we keep these different habitats or landscapes? It takes some type of disturbance. So it could be a natural disturbance, flood, fire, windstorm, tree fall. It could be a small event, one big tree got too old and fell over. It could be a major windstorm that just kind of clear cut a path through. But that opens up sunlight coming down in the forest and new opportunity there for new trees. So while we don't like to think of trees dying, but it takes some kind of disturbance. Those are some natural ones. People cause disturbance, right? I mean, not saying that's terrible. We need homes to live in, we need roads, we need buildings, but if you clear land and build on it, develop it, we're changing. We're changing the habitat that used to be there. So when you see an area like this, the park's just up here, I see the green areas that are forested in between. I guarantee you, it used to be all forest, right? Yeah. And now it's broken up. Oh, humans aren't the only ones that that change. There's only one other animal that we know of that changes the whole landscape on the scale almost that humans do. And we've got them here big time, right? When they chew down the trees and make a dam, and suddenly we have a wetland where there used to be a field, right? So industrious beaver. But it's disturbance. They're changing the habitats. People change landscapes in a lot of other ways, though, that you may not think of right away, maybe more indirect ways. We understand when you bring in a bulldozer and clear the land, okay, we're changing the habitat. We do all sorts of things, though. Does anybody know that beautiful flower? It grows purple and striped. I'm glad you know it. Do we want to plant it? No. Okay, very good. Very good. That was marketed heavily for years because it's gorgeous. It's easy to grow. But what happens? It looks beautiful in your garden, but then it escapes and it's in the wet fields and wetlands, and it's invasive, and it's crowding out all the native things. So it becomes a big problem. People didn't intend that when they brought it in, right? This is a chestnut, American chestnut. That was the most common tree in the eastern forest in the U.S. I read somewhere that approximately 1 out of every 4 trees in the mixed deciduous forest was an American chestnut 100 years ago. And we brought in some pathogens by accident, and there it went. Mile-a-minute vine is a new threat that's coming in, not because it's beautiful to use in landscaping, but it's like the new kudzu. There's a little bit of seed or fragment or root in some mulch, and it gets transported, and next thing you know, it's taken over. So that's one. It's not around here yet. It is in Connecticut and other areas. Keep your eyes peeled because it's very.
Pea family?
It's very scary. No, it's I forget the name of the family, but we also, as we impact wildlife, that can change the landscape too. The house sparrows were brought in from Europe and released in New York, and they've taken over and crowded out a lot of other native birds out of the cavities. Passenger pigeons, overhunting. A lot of times we think of that, overhunting, but you know what else can happen? Underhunting. With the loss of some of the native predators. And deer, when they're overpopulated, overgrazed, there's no forest understory, there are no younger trees coming up, they've really changed the landscape. Okay? So how do we keep our field Well, let me just say, this is another use. We looked at the developed area, you know, the roads, the houses. When we put a field in agricultural use, we're also really altering the landscape, right? Those aren't native plants that were growing there. And when the agriculture stops, it doesn't necessarily become a native habitat. So this is one of the fields at the park that's been planted very specifically, some of the native field plants added in. So it's the same field. This is just early in the season, and then a little later it's growing in. And you see a variety of grasses and goldenrods, and some of the other things will come in. This is a hay field in production, right? You see that? It's just green hay, just one thing. And even after about 15 years or more, if you just leave it alone, new plants don't get in there so easily or so quickly. It can take like 20 years, and it's not really a native landscape. It's a field, and some of the wildlife will use it, but it's not got all the native host species in it, the food plants that the wildlife eat, right? Here's another photo, historic photo set. This is what New England looked like in general, again, about 100 years ago. Here's what it looks like today. We've got a lot more forest cover now than we used to, because the early settlers had done such an industrious job of clearing for agriculture. So now, if you stop farming, I mean, not everybody's going to work super hard to keep the fields open as fields, right? So they just let it go, and eventually it turns back to forest. So that gets a little bit to that question. So what are we doing at the park? We have been carefully watching the diversity of landscapes and working to maintain so that we don't lose those fields and just watch them all become forest. So as we want to keep that variety out there, and where we want to keep the thickets, which aren't the most beautiful, but we want to keep them as thickets, that's one of our tools. We're not using, I think they did a few controlled burns in years past, but we're using a bush hog, or we're using heavier equipment to go in. The grassy fields we'll mow every year, just to keep the woody things out. The thickets we're going to let grow about 5 or 6 years, so they'll get more woody and shrubby and gawky looking, and then we'll have to go in with heavier equipment, but we'll cut it back again so that it doesn't just all become forest, right? That's how we're maintaining a variety of habitats. The forests and the wetlands, we don't have to do so much to. They're a little more stable, but we do have to monitor and be sure that we are not getting invasive plant species coming in, or any other issue that could degrade the landscape. So we'll do that. We do have, we'll have service projects. You mentioned the kiwanis. We've had other groups come out cutting things like multiflora rose. Boy, that's hard labor.
Get some goats.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, we could feed a lot of goats. So some things that you might be able to do as homeowners, as gardeners, thinking about what materials you are bringing in, because you know about things like purple loosestrife or multiflora rose. Don't plant those, right? But you know, the industry, the nursery industry is always looking for the next, you know, if it's some exotic ground cover that just is really easy, it gets established really fast, it grows like with low maintenance, and it'll fill the area. I'd be kind of careful about that. I really strongly advocate that you try to plant native plants or cultivars of native plants as much as you can. Things like the bittersweet, Japanese knotweed, all these rogues gallery have taken over. Two of our biggest problems in the forest, well, multiflora rose is probably our worst at the park. Japanese barberry is another really horrible one that we have. Look at some of these that are, you know, they're brought in for landscaping. The burning bush, it's beautiful. It takes over the park. Absolutely. English ivy, grows up, I mean, that's just starting to grow up a trunk, but I've seen them really cover things. I even found we are being overrun in some of our fields by mugwort, if you don't recognize that. And I know some of the neighbors near Northwest Park have it in their yards too. Very hard to get rid of. It looks like it's related to ragweed. It just takes over. I found that for sale as like an herb for some, medicinal purposes or a tea or something. It's a horrible invasive. Yes.
How about your ponds? Any sink foil? Have you noticed any?
I haven't noticed that as much. We do have a little bits of things here and there, some Phragmites and such.
Yeah.
Nothing terrible, but yeah, we do. Another thing you can do, I mean, sometimes it's sort of the lesser of two evils, right? If you're trying to maintain your landscape. But I would try to minimize pesticide use because the pollinators can be affected and they will then in turn affect the landscape, right? And okay, final little thing I just to mention, I love cats. I'm a lifelong cat owner. Indoor, please.
Yes.
They are devastating to native bird populations. They can't help it. Look at this guy. They're a predator. And they really, all the evidence is that they have been devastating to songbird populations, which again impacts the whole landscape, right? So those are, some things we're doing. I'd like to just really briefly tell you about, in addition to managing our landscapes and trying to work with to get out the invasive plants as well as we can. There's a special trail right near the Nature Center called the Sensory Trail, and it was put in about 12 years ago, I think, as an accessible trail for people with seeing impairment or mobility issues. It's a level, there's a guide rope, there are even some braille signs. That is a trail that got overrun completely by that mugwort herb. I'm just going to move to a nicer picture there. By the mugwort herb, the part of the trail went into the edge of the forest, and it's all bittersweet vines and grapevines and multiflora rose, and it wasn't in good shape. And then the signs were just falling apart due to sun and weather, age. So we're really revamping this trail, and we're kind of editing the trail a bit, redesigning the path and where it goes. And I'm working with a horticulturist who specializes in native landscapes to showcase our pollinator plants for butterflies and other pollinators, as well as the native things. And by the time we're done, I was doing this project last year. I thought it'd be a one-season project, and then we discovered the mugwort was so much worse than we thought. It became a 2 to 3 season project, okay? But it's a wonderful place for people to connect with the natural world, and we want to encourage them to use all their senses, looking and smelling and listening, and to have that nature experience very close and accessible. So we're just getting to the part this spring where we're going to be doing more plantings and editing. We have a pretty nice butterfly garden in one part of this trail, but we are looking for a little help. So if any of you might be interested, what we're really looking for are, a couple people who could come every couple weeks or so and just look and see, do we need to just pull a few weeds along the edges, or just tend it a little bit. This is not going to be a very high maintenance garden. We want it to be much more of a natural landscape, but we want to keep it interesting and edit it well and keep the mugwort out. So that's one project we have. And I would invite you to let me know by all means if you might be interested in that project, helping us out, and you would get to work alongside my wonderful native horticulturist, Robin Zitter, who's helping us. She's coming all the way from Sharon, Connecticut to come work on this project. So I think you'd find her interesting. And one other thing I'll mention is in just 2 weeks or so, on April 20th, Saturday, is the day that we celebrate Earth Day at the parks, Saturday. And that morning, we're going to have a lot of projects for people from the community to come help with, spreading mulch or, raking, trimming shrubs or what have you, a little bit of this and that. So if you are able to come on out on April 20th, it's Saturday, between 9 and 12, give us an hour, give us a couple hours. We would really love to have you. Okay. Yes.
So, the town dump, which is really a dump,
Landfill.
It's not a dump,
is
landfill.
gonna be closing, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
So, what's happening with that, I know that if you take the Braille Trail and you continue, you're going into a new trail area which brings you down to the Beaver Pond. I love that trail. But I've noticed that there is this runoff or these pipes that go from the landfill down the hill, and they have venting areas.
Those are test wells. Yeah, I think it's the USGS is doing periodic testing to make sure, looking for any issues of leachates coming out of the landfill.
Okay.
And they, I've been told that it's really, they haven't found
They haven't found it,
problems.
and that was put in purposely by the town.
Right, and it's a way
For
that
a good reason.
they're watching to make sure that we don't have
Yeah,
problems.
they're keeping a real close eye on that.
I'm going to wrap two questions into
Sure.
one. I'm wondering why you no longer do a controlled burn, and if you were to do a controlled burn, do you feel that would do a more effective job on the invasives?
Controlled burns are a little tricky, and they had, I think the last one they did, a little tense, it was before my time. And they just, there's too many neighborhoods right next
Yes,
to
yeah.
the park. It's really not easy to control in that small space.
So
So
it
I think
means
the cutting is a good means of, as long as we keep up with it, it's a good way of doing. Now, let me just say, because we are making some changes, we've been cutting the fields every year, but we are now implementing some of the other management strategies that just never fully went into force. We don't have the heavier equipment that we need. If we let a field grow for like 5 or 6 years, now the woody stuff is too big for our mower to go through. But we are committed to having somebody come in with the right equipment. So you might see some things going that had been cut every year before. And I know I've had some people ask, like, what's going on? You're not mowing the fields anymore? Are you just giving up on them? No, we are managing them the way we always intended to, so that we'll have that variety. So again, remember, thickets might be kind of the gawky teenage stage, but this is being done intentionally to support that diversity of wildlife.
How bad is your tick situation?
Frankly, I think I only found a tick on myself once. We have them there, but the deer are not hugely overpopulated here, so it hasn't been terrible. Sure. One more?
When I was in Florida, I heard that Connecticut has the most trees of any state in the United States. Have you ever heard that?
Most, as in
Variety.
species?
Variety.
Oh, I don't believe that would be quite true. We probably have a pretty high variety, but Appalachia, up in the Appalachian Mountain, like around the Great Smokies, I think is generally regarded as the highest diversity, because long ago, when there were glaciers, came and scrubbed a lot of the land clear, those higher mountains sort of harbored some species there. But we have pretty diverse forests. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.